Yeah, it really is my pleasure to be introducing Sybille today. So Sybille McKeown is a program manager of the Methodology Transformation Branch in the Methodology Division at the Australian Bureau of Statistics, or ABS. ABS, of course, is one of our ASEM's partners right from the very beginning. So Sybille is responsible for development of methodological capabilities that enable the ABS to exploit new data sources and deliver multi-source data solutions. So her branch develops and uses a variety of analytical methods, including data visualization, data integration methods, confidentiality methods, and also machine learning. She's had a few previous roles at the ABS, including Director of Transport and Tourism Statistics, Director of the National Centre for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Statistics. Sybille holds a Bachelor of Science in Mathematics from Murdoch University in Western Australia, and she's currently undertaking postgraduate studies in applied data analytics at the ANU. So it's really my pleasure to hand over to Sybille for her keynote presentation today.
Thanks very much, Louise, and hi everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. Now I'll just start by sharing my screen and hopefully that all works. I need to tell you a funny story. My computer died this morning, so I'm on a replacement laptop with different software than what I'm used to. And I had to quickly do some fast footwork with my slides to make them come through. So can I just check that my slides are coming through okay there?
Yes.
Fantastic. And I apologise in advance if I mess up the transition because I'm not used to presenting slides on this PDF scale. But anyway, enough excuses. Just kicking off, I'd also like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners on the lands that we're all meeting on all around the country today. So it's the Turrbal and Jagera peoples here in Brisbane where I am. And I'd also like to pay my respects to elders past and present. So the next thing I need to do is actually make a confession. I'm not actually who my bio says I am. I was all of those things until Friday last week, but as of Monday, I've changed roles and I'm now in a new branch and I'm heading up the Labour and Income Indicators branch here at the ABS. And the reason I stuck with my old bio was because I thought it was good background, because the last time I actually changed roles when I moved into my previous role was a little bit over 6 years ago. And in my very first external engagement in that particular role was attending the ASEM's launch at QUT. And so I've been on the industry partnership journey since then. And since I was there at the opening stages of the centre, I thought it was really lovely when Scott asked me to do the industry keynote, when you're now sort of in the stages of starting to think about the closing of the stages of the centre. That is until he gave me the writing instructions, the dreaded after lunch spot right before you get into the really interesting bits, although hopefully Peter's warmed you up a bit. 45 minutes to an hour and any topic, as long as it's entertaining, engaging, and possibly includes a focus on ASEM's legacy. So, well, I can't promise entertaining or engaging, so do turn off your cameras if you think you're going to drop off to sleep, because that would be off-putting. That's one of the benefits of doing this thing by Zoom. But I will share with you my thoughts on an ASEM's legacy. So I'm going to take you on a bit of a ride. First, I'll talk about why I think it's worth investing in actually creating an ASEM's legacy from where I'm sitting, so from the public sector point of view. And then I'm going to reflect on the ABS and ASEM's partnership journey and unpack why it's successful. And based on those reflections, I'll share with you my thoughts about what I think sits at the core of the ASEM's, of an ASEM's legacy. And so in preparing for today, the first thing I did, well, aside from seeing if a new job would get me out of it, was to jump online to see what I could find out about the definition of the legacy. Now, all good presentations start with Google, right? And so, as is usually the case, I found some helpful things and some less helpful things, like scars or the legacy of chickenpox, and software that has been superseded but not replaced. Not at all where I wanted to take the conversation today, but I did finally find a definition that I think fits. And that is, if I can get my slides to do the right thing for me, making a contribution to future generations. And I really like this definition of a legacy because I think it's a really great way of thinking about ASEMs and the opportunities for the future. So, making a contribution to future generations. Why should you even care? As I said, I'll give you my perspective as an industry partner from the public sector. And I think it boils down to two very good reasons. One's to do with demand and the other's to do with opportunities. So I think the demands for the skills of the centre for the mathematical sciences has never been greater in the public sector. And similarly, the opportunities are growing and there is an abundance of interesting research problems on the horizon. So let me talk about these in a bit more detail. So just starting with the demand side, I want to give you a bit of a sense of the increasing demand for the skills of the centre over the last 5 years in the public sector. There have been a number of significant developments over that time period that have propelled the demand for better and more innovative use of data and data insights in the public service, as well as recognising the value of data in the broader context. So I'll step you through a bit of a timeline and starting back in 2015. So back in 2015, the head of the Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet, or PMNC, commissioned a study on how the public sector could be better using data to achieve efficiencies for government, to foster the digital economy, and generally be helpful outside of the government context to lift productivity and growth. And while the study was led by PMNC, it also included team members from the Department of Finance, us here at the ABS, the ATO, the Australian Taxation Office, and Department of Communications. And the study recognised that data volumes were growing and that the potential value of this data was also growing. And importantly, it found that data was underutilised in the APS, in the Australian Public Service. And that by making the most of the data that we did hold as a public service, the Commonwealth could grow the digital economy and also improve people's lives by transforming how policies and services are delivered. So the report also delivered a roadmap for change, which included, among other things, a real emphasis on building capabilities in the use of data. So a few days after that report was released, the Australian Government Public Data Policy was launched as part of the National Innovation and Science Agenda. And in that policy, once again, the value of data was linked to benefits for the Australian public and also our competitiveness in the digital economy. And collaboration with researchers was highlighted as important in this policy for finding innovative ways to extract value from data. So moving forward to 2016, PMNC provided a progress update on that particular roadmap from 2015. So the update noted significant progress on the recommendations made in the report and the original report. There were quite a lot of recommendations, and I just wanted to highlight a couple of them. So one of them was changes to how policy proposals were framed to mandate the inclusion of evidence based on data. This had never been done before. So a really important step. It also involved establishing a network of data champions. So these were senior public servants whose role it was to promote the use of data within the public service and really initiate a bunch of projects that demonstrated value. So through those projects, some really interesting, momentum was building. And just one example that I want to mention is a collaboration we undertook at the ABS together with the Bureau of Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Economics, where we were looking at how GPS data from trucks could be used to inform statistics about road freight movement and traffic congestion. So they were the kind of projects that were commissioned to really demonstrate the value of data. So this was followed up in 2017 with a Data Integration Partnership for Australia, or DIPA. You may have heard of DIPA. It was a 3-year government investment to support an increase in the creation and use of linked data assets. And it involved funding for the ABS to develop the data linking methods, the linked data assets themselves, and the supporting infrastructure. So that included the creation of the ABS Data Lab, which was set up to facilitate better access to the linked data assets, both within government and for researchers. And examples of the data sets that you might have heard of were things like MADIP, not the best acronym in the world, a multi-agency data integration project, but basically a person-based linked data asset, and BLADE, which is the economic or business-focused version of that. So there was also funding provided to establish a number of cross-agency analytical hubs. So their job was to extract some real value for government from these linked data assets. And there were a number of these hubs set up in different domains. So it's not the best picture on the slide there, but basically there was a social health and wellbeing focused hub, an economic data hub, another one focused on the physical environment, and one focused around government business. So DIPA was all about connecting data across government to create enriched data assets available for analysis. So further supporting this agenda in 2018, the Office of the National Data Commissioner was established. So here there was a focus on enabling better data sharing, again to underpin better use of data in the public sector. And so here better refers to a number of things, including addressing legislative barriers to data sharing between agencies. You might be surprised how many of those exist. And ensuring data is shared in a safe way, which includes building trust in the community about these sort of initiatives. And then last year we saw the independent review of the Australian Public Service. And this is one of the most detailed reviews conducted of the APS since the 1970s. And it concluded that while the APS wasn't broken, so to speak, there were a number of significant changes to be made to prepare for the future. And there was a whole chapter on embracing data and digital, which focused on making better use of data and the need to build up expertise in the public sector in the use of data. And then finally this year, to follow the outcomes of that review and as a direct result of one of the recommendations of that review, the APS data professional stream was established. And David Gruen, our Australian statistician and head of the ABS, was appointed as the head of this, this data professional stream. And it's all about having some leadership and some momentum around building data expertise within the APS. So the last 5 years has really seen data move more and more into the spotlight for the Australian Public Service. That is at the federal government level, which is what I've taken you through here on this little history lesson. But it's also worth adding that at the same time as all this is going on, we're seeing similar trends at the state and territory government level. For example, most state and territory governments now have their own data linking and analytics centres. And looking forward, there's more to come. One example, the ABS in the last budget, there was an announcement that we would get some additional funding starting from 21-22 to basically increase ABS capacity to create timely insights from big data. So there is an increasing demand for innovative use of data to create insights across the public sector. So the environment is right for an ASIM's legacy. So now onto the opportunity side. I said there was an abundance of interesting problems to be solved. And I want to illustrate this using an ABS example, using some recent work we've undertaken to measure the impacts of COVID. So just to set a bit of context, there's actually a bunch of things that we've done in response to COVID. We've established 2 rapid response surveys, collecting data on the impact of COVID on households and businesses. We've started releasing preliminary results from our retail trade survey to get to decision makers faster. And we've tapped into some new data sources to create new insights. So this includes some exploratory work with new data sources like smart meter electricity data and bank transactions data. And all of these examples have had and will continue to have their own interesting methodological challenges. But the one I really want to drill down into as an example is the single touch payroll data, or STP. So STP, which is now dear to my heart, as I now have responsibility for producing these numbers in my new branch. And actually we released a new set of numbers today, so go check out the ABS website if you want the latest figures. This is last fortnight's release. So single touch payroll, what is it? So it's a new data source for the ABS. We've only really been working with it since probably around April, May, earlier this year, and it was something we'd been working towards. It's data sourced from the Australian Taxation Office. We've been working towards getting access to it for a while, but the whole COVID situation really propelled that process forward. So as I said, it's provided to the ABS from the ATO, but ultimately it's sourced from businesses who utilise single touch payroll software for their payroll and accounting purposes. So single touch payroll software was introduced to reduce the burden on businesses in terms of meeting the tax reporting obligations. So what happens is every time one of these businesses runs their payroll, whether that's a weekly, fortnightly, monthly, or some other frequency of payment, their payroll information, so the number of employees, wages, etc., is automatically sent to ATO, which simplifies the process for them in terms of reporting. So it's essentially a data stream through to the ATO. And then what happens is the ATO provides us at the ABS a weekly snapshot of this data, and then we transform it into a number of different ways to produce the weekly payroll jobs and wages indices. So there's two indexes. There's this payroll jobs index and the payroll wages index, which is what you're seeing on the slide there. Now on the surface, that all sounds pretty straightforward, right? However, sitting below these numbers, there's quite a range of methodological challenges that we've had to overcome. And I think it's possibly one of the most underappreciated aspects of working with these kinds of new data sources, using found data rather than design data like from a survey. So let me give you some examples of that. Because we want to publish fortnightly statistics, one of the first things we had to do was work out how to impute for missing jobs and wages information for those businesses who don't pay their employees on a weekly or fortnightly basis. So if your employees are paid monthly, we'll only get that data through once a month. So with our fortnightly release, we have to come up with a way of imputing for your missing jobs and wages information. So that's one example. Another example is the revisions methodology. So we do ultimately get that real data in from the businesses, so we can remove the impute that we've put into the series and revise the series so it reflects the actual wages and jobs information. We've also had to work out how we want to deal with a number of anomalies in the data. So things that perhaps don't align with the economic concepts we're trying to demonstrate here, but are an actual feature of the administrative data source. So for example, when there's spikes in wages due to bonuses being paid or back pay, we want to ensure that the way that we reflect those in the data series aligns conceptually with our other frameworks for economic statistics, like the systems of national accounts. So we've had to work through those issues as well. And also thinking towards the dissemination side of things, we've also worked through innovative ways to present the data. So for example, through some interactive graphs and maps, I should say, interactive maps that you should go and check out on the website to make it most useful for consumers of our data, because there's a real demand for regional level information here. And all of this involves working with some pretty large data sets by our standards, with data for about 10 million jobs being considered every single fortnight that we're doing this process. So these are the problems that we've already solved, right? But we've only really just started scratching the surface on how this data set could be used. As I said, it's only fairly new to us. And the horizon is filled with interesting new challenges and research questions as we expand its use to create more value. So let me paint you a picture. Jobs and wages are clearly of interest in terms of measuring impact of COVID, but this only covers people with jobs. So what about people who've lost their jobs? What's their journey? Could we link the STP data to other data, such as unemployment benefit payments, to get a more complete picture? What about the longitudinal picture? Are people moving in and out of the workforce between industries in different jobs? And we know education is a key factor in employment. And what are the varying effects of COVID for people with different levels of education or qualifications? Could we link it to some kind of education data to complete the picture out in that sense? Are there any skills gaps emerging? How might this impact business productivity? What else is impacting business productivity as a result? And the list goes on. I'm sure you can come up with your own interesting research questions that this data could contribute to. But the message I really want to get across, and hopefully you can take away, is that the important issues for government policy, particularly in this current time, the issues are connected. So narrowly focused data sets and analysis won't be enough to inform these issues. We need to find ways to connect the large volumes of data now available to enable more meaningful analysis and to create greater insight. And I think that's where the future challenges come in. So while STP had a number of interesting methodological challenges for us to solve, that was just working with one data set. These challenges will undoubtedly multiply as we find ways to join more data sets and attempt to make sense of those data so that we can uncover the insights. So I think the potential for research to add value here is really significant. So let me summarise the why you should care. The skills and expertise found in ASEMS are really clearly in demand. And from where I sit in the public sector, they're more in demand now than they have ever been before. And add to that the fact that there are a growing number of interesting research questions to be addressed in the public sector as we look to capitalise on the volumes of data now available to us, to connect them, to analyse them, and to create insights that will inform policy development to benefit the Australian public. So they're the reasons I think it's worth thinking about an ASEMS legacy to make a contribution to future generations. So the next thing I want to talk about is my reflections on the ABS and ASEMS partnership journey. And as I said before, I've been on the journey from the start. So it was really helpful for me to think about that in the context of a legacy. And I want to talk to you about why I think the partnership has been successful from an industry partner point of view, but also why you should think it's successful from an ASEMS point of view. So let's start with why we wanted to partner with ASEMS in the first place. Well, as you heard before, at the time, I was still working in the methodology division. And just to give you a bit of context there, the methodology division in the ABS has two roles. The first is to guide and advise on the application of statistical methods in the production of ABS outputs, like the single touch payroll, and across the whole range of topic areas included in the ABS. So labour force, GDP, health statistics, all of those things. And the advice can be on survey design, sampling methods, time series analysis, data linking, statistical disclosure control, a wide range of applications. And the second role is to look over the horizon, to anticipate the future needs of the ABS in terms of methods for statistical production. And so not surprisingly, at the time of the beginning of ASEMS, things like the use of big data and AI, machine learning, they were front of mind for us in terms of those over the horizon sort of issues. And so we had aspirations in those areas, but we also recognised our limitations. You know, it was all pretty new to us. So we really saw the potential value in partnering with ASEMS to build our capability in these new areas and to collaborate on some of the more difficult problems. So capability and problem solving were our key objectives. And from my point of view, I think we've been successful in achieving these objectives through the partnership. On the capability side of things, we've achieved quite a lot together. We've had a number of workshops where we've brought together ASEM's researchers with ABS staff to identify research problems that would benefit from collaboration. I'm sure some of you have been involved with those along the way. Another example is that ASEM's developed and delivered a 3-day workshop on statistical machine learning and big data for about 50 ABS staff across a number of locations. And we've had ASEM's researchers as part of our methodology advisory committee. So that's an advisory committee that provides peer review on ABS methodological developments. We've also had a number of successes in terms of solving problems. So there's been some really great work on machine learning for a range of ABS problems. For example, a couple of years ago, we worked together on using machine learning methods to predict dwelling occupancy, which is a key element of the census field operations. So with limited resources and time, we don't want to be sending our field staff out to dwellings that are likely to be vacant. So having a really good way to predict the likelihood of the dwelling being occupied has become a key feature of designing our field operations. And another example is some exploratory work on how innovative methods could be used to detect malicious use of our interactive table builder tool. So that's our tool that allows users to self-serve in terms of creating bespoke tables of confidentialized data. And we wanted to have an efficient and robust way of identifying when people were doing the wrong thing there. So some great work to explore different approaches there. So from our point of view, we've achieved the objectives of the partnership. We've built capability and we've solved some important problems. And what about from an ASEM's point of view? You're obviously best placed to judge success, but I'll give you my opinion on the matter. So when I consider the ASEM's statement of intent, 3 key objectives jump out at me. So that's research, translation, and insight. And I think they're actually really great criteria for assessing the success of the partnership. And I think there has been good research done. The research has been translated to ABS context and ultimately had impact through the implementation of research outcomes to solve ABS business problems. So hopefully you're at the point where you're agreeing with me that the ABS and ASEM's partnership has been a success. And now I want to unpack why I think it was a success by drilling down into one particular example. And the example I want to draw on is work we did to explore the use of satellite imagery data for the purposes of official statistics. So let me set the scene. It was early days for ABS in terms of our interest in exploring big data for official statistics. And big data was quite the buzzword amongst national statistical offices around the world. But it was still all largely hypothetical or at exploratory sort of stages. And in fact, I can remember someone at an international meeting saying at the time that big data was like teenage sex. Everyone was talking about it, but no one was doing it. And I thought that was actually quite an apt way of describing it at the time. There was a lot of talk and a lot of action. Anyway, we set our sights on satellite imagery data as one of the first that we were interested in exploring. So we wanted to know, could we use it to either replace or augment our agricultural statistics, for example, statistics around crop production. So we saw that it had the potential to provide a number of benefits for the ABS in terms of increasing the frequency of statistical outputs, so good for our users, and reducing the reporting burden on farmers. So, good for our data providers. We ask them a lot of questions. So, that's always something that we'd like to do less of. So we reached out to our ASEM's partners for some help. And I'm not sure if you're here, but I'm sorry to Kerry Mangerson and James McBroom. I'm going to make an example of you here. So I'm sorry, but I'm going to do it anyway. So it was Kerry and James that we started some work with, initially focused on the methods that we were using to predict crop type from the satellite imagery data, paired up with some ground truth data from the Queensland government. But we weren't alone in being interested in this work. the international official statistics community was also very interested. And in fact, the interest was part of a broader push to develop capability in the use of big data for official statistics. And you can see their logo on the screen here. The UN Statistical Division actually established a working group on big data for official statistics, and the ABS was part of this. And part of our role on the working group was to chair a task team, and the task team that we chaired was on the use of satellite imagery data and geospatial data for official statistics purposes. So what started out as research for Kerry and James quickly transformed into being asked to join the Australian contingent in the satellite imagery task team, where we also had members from other countries all around the world. And I can tell you that Kerry and James made a really great contribution. So the task team had committed to producing a handbook on the use of satellite data for official statistics. And the handbook was quite extensive. You can find it online, it's really long. I mean, it included a number of chapters. There was chapters on data sources, on showcase examples of pilot projects from around the world. And there was guidance to statisticians in the UN system on how to use satellite imagery data in their domains. And there was a really strong link there to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, where this data set was this sort of data was seen as having a lot of promise. But the handbook also included a chapter on methods, and that's where Kerry and James got roped in once more. And they basically wrote that whole chapter on methods for the handbook, and they did a fabulous job. And along the way, they also invested to get to know us well. So this included banter during late night Zoom meetings, because there were a lot of those with trying to accommodate all the different time zones. You know, it included things like chats over a break during a conference, or a glass of wine in the evenings at a conference, that kind of thing. And this initial sort of work then led to other things for Kerry and James. So following the release of the handbook, Kerry was asked by the UN to lead the development and delivery of a training course based on that methods chapter. And it was a course aimed at developing countries who were keen on using satellite data to measure progress against a number of the UN Sustainable Development Goals that I mentioned earlier. And so ABS, we wrapped up our work with this task team and the UN group following the delivery of the handbook, but the ASEMS connection continued, with Kerry still making a contribution to the working group and the measurement of sustainable development goals, particularly through the training. And Kerry can probably tell you a bit more about it at some point, but I believe she still has connections to the global working group and the initiatives that it's taking forward now. So I think you'll agree that the partnership between ABS and ASEMS has been a success, both from an ABS and broader statistical system point of view, and also from an ASEMS point of view. So there was definitely good research done. It was effectively translated to the official statistics context worldwide, and has most definitely had an impact in terms of building knowledge and capability in new data sources for national statistical officers. And the key dimensions of the ASEMS intent statement were all part of that picture. So there was research, translation, and impact. But for me, the common theme, the thing that underpins each of those dimensions, is actually relationships. And let me explain why I'm saying that. So starting with research, from an industry partner point of view, relevance is the key here. That is, the research has to be relevant for our industry context. And from the outside, it can actually be quite hard to fully appreciate the context to know what's relevant. But by connecting on a personal level, at a relationship level, Kerry and James and others were able to get a good sense of our context and identify relevance. Next, translation. So as you may know, that there is more to translation than just transcribing of words. I'm sure you've all had that interesting experience with Google Translate, where the nuances in language are, you know, amusingly lost in translation when it's just a direct word-for-word thing. To be an effective translator, you need to spend some time with native speakers to get a good handle of the nuances in the language. And the same thing applies in this context. So by spending time with us, Kerry and James were able to really develop a good understanding of our lingo And so we're able to translate research in a way that was meaningful to us. And finally, impact. So impact happens when research outputs or solutions to problems are adopted or implemented in the industry context, in my view. And it's not as simple as developing a solution, having the best solution in the world and essentially throwing it over the fence. There's always a whole bunch of factors involved in adoption of a new idea or a new solution to lead to successful implementation. The stars need to align in terms of timing, funding and resources, and appetite for change within the organisation. And again, here it's relationships that are the key to success, because through our relationships, Kerry and James were able to navigate the problem space effectively. So it turned out that the use of satellite data was not feasible for adoption for ABS at that time, but Kerry was able to use her knowledge and her relationships to pivot the research and the collaborative efforts to the UN context and to have impact in another setting. So the common thread here is relationships. So that's my proposition to you in terms of what I think lies at the core of an ASEM's legacy. So it's the strength of ASEM's relationships with each other and with the industry partners that's at the core of an ASEM's legacy. And the important point is that it's not just any relationship. It's actually a special kind of relationship that we're aiming for here. So it's not a transactional relationship. It's a relationship that moves beyond the boundaries of the existing problem and puts the relationships at the centre. And I'll explain using an analogy. And I think I must have missed Allergy 101 in school, but it always is difficult for me to come up with a good analogy. And it took me a while to come up with one that wasn't involving drawing inappropriate parallels to adult relationships. So I didn't want to go there. But anyway, I did come up with one, and that one that was front of mind, and that's my relationship with my hairdresser. So it's front of mind because I'm looking forward to an appointment next week so that the greys are starting to show through again. So let me tell you about my relationship with my hairdresser and why it's one of these special type of relationships that keeps on giving, at least to future generations of my hairstyles. So about 8 years ago, when I was new to Brisbane and I had a toddler and a newborn baby, I was desperate to find a hairdresser. And after some online searching, I came across Lyndall, who at that time was running a local salon, and it was pitched perfectly for me. She advertised as only taking one client at a time, and that clients were free to bring their kids because they wouldn't disturb anyone else. I thought, perfect, just what I needed. There's nothing worse, those of you who have kids will know, there's nothing worse than being in a crowded place and needing to deal with a bored toddler and a crying baby, with a million people around, with dye on your hair and who else knows what's going on. So like many relationships, this one started out as purely transactional. So the transaction was at the centre. It was all about getting a haircut in the most efficient way possible. And again, if you've looked after young children, you'll know how important that is. Managing a daily shower can be hard enough, let alone getting a haircut. Anyway, Lyndall always did a great job, and her business model really suited me, so I kept going back. And over time, our relationship developed. We chatted about different things, as you do with your hairdresser. We got to know each other and we found some common ground. So she also had young children and was juggling work at the same time. We both enjoyed camping and various random fitness pursuits, so could share stories on all those things. And our relationship then moved beyond the bounds of the immediate transaction, the haircut. And also through that growing and developing relationship, Lyndall really developed a good sense for what I was looking for in a hairstyle. She knew my context. So she knew that I would never want a hairstyle that was high maintenance because I would just never look after it. And Lyndall also was able to develop a nuanced understanding of my language, so she could effectively translate her haircut to my style. So for example, she came to know that I wasn't particularly adventurous when it comes to hairstyles. So on the occasions I came in asking for something a bit different, she knew there were actually some fairly narrow boundaries to what I meant by different. And through the relationship, there was definitely an impact beyond the realms of a haircut. So, for example, on one occasion, I was able to help Lyndall out by lending her some camping gear. There was also a time where we did a Tough Mudder event together. It was a last-minute arrangement after my own team members had pulled out at the last minute due to injury. And so we developed this special kind of a relationship over time, which was beyond the realms of the haircut, the transaction. And so there's the moral to the story, that there's been a real legacy created through the relationship. Lyndall moved on from her single person salon. She moved to a larger salon, moved again to mobile hairdressing model, and now is working from her home-based salon. And I followed her through all of these different transitions. And I've done this because of our relationship. It's the relationship that's now at the core, as opposed to the haircut. And I know that this relationship will continue to give into the future as my hair gets brighter, and no doubt in the future when I'm ready for my nano perm. So let me summarise. We've been on a bit of a windy path here. So the key points I want you to take away. So for me, a legacy is all about making a contribution to the future generations. And the future is rich with interesting data opportunities, a great environment for an ASIMS legacy. And in my view, it's the quality of your relationships that will lie at the core of an ASIMS legacy. This includes the relationships you have with industry partners who you'll hear from this afternoon, but also the relationships you have with one another in the centre, which is something that Peter mentioned earlier. And now I'm not going to go as far as suggesting that you should go out and offer to do Tough Mudder events with your industry partners, but you do need to make sure that you invest in those relationships beyond the boundaries of the immediate research problem. And the research problems will come and go, but it's the special kind of relationships that will keep on giving into the future. So as you proceed through the rest of the retreat, I want to challenge you to assess the status of your own relationships with the industry partners that you'll hear from today and with each other. And ask yourself, are these the types of relationships that are going to carry forward to an ASIMS legacy? And that was all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sybille. That was great. Lots of fodder there for some interesting discussion. Just want to remind people, you have several options here for asking questions. You can either raise your hands and I'll call on you, or you can put your questions into chat and I can pose the questions for you. But while you're all just getting your questions in place there, I have a couple of questions of my own that maybe I'll kick things off with. So I actually want to start, I had a few questions based in the beginning, but I think I want to go backwards because I'm fascinated by your little story about relationships, and your hairdresser story is great, and lots of really interesting analogies there. And it's interesting because I've just been in the throes of writing a discussion for a reprint of an old paper by Professor Sir Austin Bradford Hill, who, this is back in the 1960s, where he's talking about, you know, how does a statistical scientist engage? And he's talking, and it's a very funny little article. I'll put a link in the chat for people in a minute. But he talks exactly about this. He talks about a symbiotic relationship, and that it's in that symbiosis where the statistician or the machine learner or whatever, through the relationships, learns a lot about what the other person is looking for, learns some of the language, learns some of the content, and so on. So I very much resonate with that way of thinking about things. Can you say a little bit more about some of the other partnerships that ABS has and how that relationship aspect plays out there? And in particular, when it comes to the whole data linkage effort, I imagine that's a complex landscape in terms of partnership. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. Lloyd, so Let me talk a little bit about the relationships that we have from with other government agencies in that whole of government space. And I have to be honest here and say, you know, I talk about relationships and relationships at the core, but we haven't, as an organisation, always been the best at that either. And still, actually, to this day, I think struggle to some extent to overcome that perception that we're a provider of data. It's this transactional thing with our agency colleagues in different places around the APS. So there's a lot of work that we need to do ourselves to move to that sort of more special kind of relationship place where we're seen as, you know, part of the decision-making process and that kind of thing. So it's a journey that we've been on as an organisation for, you know, probably the last 5 years at least. I can remember we've had a number of reviews that have drawn that out. And so it's something that we've really pushed from a senior leadership point of view in terms of encouraging and role modelling that engagement with our partners to, you know, it's fine to go and have a conversation that's just about, hey, how's things going on in your space, without sort of going with an agenda of, right, I need to go and achieve X, Y, and Z on my list of things from this discussion. You know, it's often those discussions over coffee, you know, or at a, you know, morning tea, impromptu sort of conversation where a lot of the really interesting things and opportunities are identified. But they're also those same opportunities to kind of connect with people on a personal level, and build that and grow confidence and trust in who you are and what you offer. So, you know, I think particularly in our digital world, it's very easy to lose that human connection. And I think that's what it really boils down to as people. It's that human connection that is really important. You know, we can have all the checklists, which we have in place in the ABS, you know, how to be a good partner. Have you done these things? Have you connected the right, you know, there can be quite a transactional approach to that, but I think it's actually those human connections. So we've changed various things over time. We're still working more on that, where we've tried to put ABS staff into positions in other government agencies. So we call them outposted officers at the federal government level, where they're an ABS person embedded in, say, Department of Health, and become a go-to person, you know, learn sort of that strategic context of that organisation and the language that people are using and what's important to them. So that's one thing that we've done. We have a similar model at the state government level. We've got what we call strategic partnership managers, who again are embedded in the state government, even though they're ABS officers, and they make that connection for us to help set some of that context and link up the right people to make their own connections. We've also tried to be really proactive, and this was largely through Dipper. Like in the early days of Dipper, there was a lot of feedback around, you know, it's such a huge cumbersome process to get access to these challenges. So we've tried to be really proactive in hearing and gathering that feedback and actually changing the way we do things, and not sort of putting up those defensive barriers of, oh, but that's how we need to do it. You know, it's like, well, how could we do it differently? And sort of really showing people that we're committed to that real connection, hearing and acting on what we're hearing.
Yeah, that's fascinating. When it comes to the whole space of data linkage, I've had a little bit of experience in the area, and you need massive trust. When you've got data sharing, you need massive trust between the partners who are trying to share data. Sometimes there'll be like a third party, like a trusted third party, who will be the owner or the custodian, not the owner, custodian of the shared data. Can you say a little bit more about how that space is navigated? How do you overcome the suspicions and the anxieties about giving away ownership and making sure that all of the delicacies around privacy, confidentiality are protected? And who holds the data? Is ABS playing a data custodian role, or can you say a bit more about how that's going to work?
Sure. So currently, let me talk about MADIP as an example. So that's the multi-agency data integration project that I talked about, and that's linking data from a number of agencies. So it includes Medicare data from Department of Health, it includes Social Security payment information from Department of Social Services, includes personal income tax data from the tax office, includes census data. So there are a number of source agencies for this, that contribute to then this product that we call MADIP. I really think we should have come up with a different name from day one, but you know, now we all know it and love it as MADIP and don't really think about what it stands for anymore. But the way the model works is that ABS is set up as the data integration authority. So each of the agencies who own the data are still owners of the data. They're still the custodians. They share their data with us as an integrating authority, and that means we've sort of been accredited as, you know, having all the right privacy practices and, you know, all the mechanisms in place to protect the data and, you know, remove identifiers and early in the process and separate linkers and analysts and all there's a whole bunch of things that go with becoming an accredited integrating authority. And then we do the linking and make the linked data asset available in the data lab. I mentioned the ABS data lab, so the microdata available in that context. And then there's an approval process to make that data available to others to access. And this is then where the custodians come back in. So while they have a lot of trust and support of ABS in terms of the procedures that we've got in place, as custodians, they still have to sign off and give the go ahead for particular projects to access that data. So they retain that ownership of who has access and who, you know, what circumstances do I think would be suitable for use of this data and which circumstances would I be not comfortable with. So it's really a shared accountability model.
Okay, well that's fascinating. And what about just the technicalities of data linkage? I remember Matt Rowan, we were at one of the earlier ABS ASEMS workshops, and we were talking a lot about, you know, how do you think about that? It's not exactly trivial always to do accurate data linkage. Do you see that as an area where there's more potential for research?
Absolutely. Yep. So, you know, I talked before about the person context and the business context. So the business context of linking is a little bit simpler because we've got unique identifiers like the Australian Business Number, ABNs, where we can draw connections between two. So it's a little bit simpler there. But on the person side, you know, we don't have a unique identifier. Yeah. You know, we have information on things like names, address and age, those kind of things, but people change their names or names are spelled incorrectly in administrative systems, people move house, you know, there's duplicates in administrative data. There's all these things with the data that mean it's not a straightforward, okay, we're just going to merge these two data sets. So we currently have an area within the ABS that does the data linking process. They're called the Data Linking Centre, and they use what we call a deterministic linkage approach. So that's all about, you know, you've got your two data sets that you want to link, and you're basically looking for agreement patterns on different variables. You know, you give weight to different types of agreement patterns. You do lots of passes over the data to make it more sort of contained and easier, because when you're working with this massive data set, you want to also try and make it as efficient as possible. So that's how we do it now. But in terms of research directions, absolutely, there's a whole area still to be explored, particularly as we want to move to linking people with businesses, so that jobs connection. You know, think broader than that. People are in businesses might have, I don't know, export transactions. You know, then you've got people, businesses and transactions, and how does that all work together? So it's that the linking that we want to do in the future is all about this network-based data and using graph databases as sort of the underlying infrastructure, and as opposed to relational databases that we do now. And, you know, that's the future for us. How do we do that? So that's in terms of the linking. And there's also, I think, a whole field of opportunity in terms of analysis of linked data and doing it in a way that takes into account some of the issues and errors that have crept in through the linkage process. So I think probably common practice now is you assume that the data set that you get that's been linked is perfect, but actually, you know, there's missed links and false links. And there's all these things that you go, well, how do you take that into account in analysis? So that's
wow. Let me just remind the audience here, if you have a question, you can put your hand up or just jump in. I know we also have some of the site. So I know Adelaide, I see that there's Adelaide group there, or you may be enjoying your little afternoon wines there too much, but if you have a question, maybe somebody can pose it, or just jump in, let me know. There's a question here from Mark Lawrence. He says, that's a good question. Linking health, tax, census data raises the risk that the public might see this as heading towards a Big Brother or a 1984 scenario. How do you manage that risk and ensure public trust in the work of the ABS? Yeah, so I guess from that public perspective as opposed to the partner perspective.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's something that's always really front of mind for us, particularly as an organisation, because trust is just core to everything that we do. If we lose trust, if we lose the trust in the ABS, there goes, census data as its own source. There goes our survey data. If people don't want to respond because there's this lack of trust. So it's always just hugely in the front of our mind, as well as, from the perspective of that, well, it's also the right thing to do, to be careful about what we're doing and only use the data that we've got. But I guess there's probably two things I want to say. Like, one is, there's a whole stream of work within the organisation on building that trust, and what we call, sometimes we refer to it as social license, and making sure that we're not overstretching. There's things that we could do, but should we? Do we have enough sort of buy-in from the public on doing some of these things? So there's a whole area that's looking at how we communicate with the public, doing research, focus groups, those kind of things, getting feedback from the public in terms of their views on certain things. We do commission privacy impact assessments and get those sort of independent perspectives on what we're doing and how we're doing it, just to get some clarity on could we and should we. And the other thing I wanted to say was there's also a whole of government lens on this, and it's also front of mind for whole of government. I think everyone kind of realises that it's really important to have the community on board with this. And I mentioned in my little timeline of events, the Office of the National Data Commissioner. So, one of their key roles is to enable that sort of data sharing to happen. But another key role, which I touched on only briefly, is really around that public trust, and making sure that there's equally emphasis on developing that trust and getting the buy-in, that we're doing things that people are not too worried about. We can only move as fast as the public is happy for us to move.
Yeah. I see we have a question from Peter Taylor. Peter?
So Sybille, great talk. A long time ago, I actually did work in the Commonwealth Government, and I was for a short time in the part of what was then the Department of Social Security that was responsible for trying to detect benefit fraud, and clearly the whole idea of data linkages and stuff would have made our job easier. But this was the early 1980s, and it was just complete anathema. For example, for us to access tax department records, it was not allowed. No one would even go there as a possible. And it strikes me that people's attitudes to that have changed enormously over that time, the 40 years. And I'd also suggest even more. I talk to my kids a lot about this. When you talk to social media and what Google and other social media sites know about us all now, it's probably true to say that the government's still behind that, in the sense that we're probably all complete open books to anyone who wants to try and track us. So do you think that government necessarily has to maybe more conservative in things like linking data together?
Look, I don't know, if more conservative is how I describe it, but I totally get where you're coming from. And, I mentioned some of the focus groups that I talked about before when we've been exploring these public sort of trust issues. And a lot of people say, oh, aren't you doing that already anyway? What's the go here? People see government, they don't necessarily see Department of Health, Department of this, Department of that. So they don't see those same barriers that are actually there. But having said that, there are there are, I guess, views that potentially in the minority that do have these concerns about effective data sharing and the risk of data breaches and all those kinds of things. So I guess it's about giving voice and hearing from all segments of the community, people with different perspectives. So yeah, there's being mindful of that, I guess, in that government context where we know there's diverse views out there, and we want to make sure that they're moving in sync. But also, I guess, in our social media, lovely headline of the minute kind of context, I think perhaps we are maybe a little more cautious or more acutely aware of the damage that one bad headline might do ahead of something important. For example, census, just from an ABS context, imagine if there was some big blow up that was really nothing for most people around privacy or linking or whatever right before the census. That could dramatically impact then, what you're sort of seeing in those news feeds and Facebooks and those kind of things. So I guess there's that acute awareness of the link between those two things. So maybe you are right, maybe more cautious is the right word for those reasons.
It's fascinating. I actually have a long list of questions here that I'd love to get a chance to ask, but we're actually pretty much out of time, and I think it's important that we give everybody a chance to go off and take a break, make a coffee or a cup of tea. So I think what we might do at this stage, if there's one last chance to see if there's any questions, not seeing any more questions come in. I really like, Sybille, I really like the way that you frame things here. I love the way that you talked about the ASAM's legacy. I think that was really fantastic. And definitely love the reinforcing that idea of relationships and so on, and building trust with partners and so on. I see there's another question from Mark, but I think at this point we probably need to finish up. And I think if you have more questions for Sybille, you can send her an email. And I think at this stage, we'll thank her very much for taking the time to present at ASAMS. And we'll see everybody back here in 15 minutes, 2:30 Melbourne time. Thanks again, Sybille.
All right.
Applause. Thank you so much.